a groundbreaking podcast dedicated to exploring critical issues in the Filipino context and addressing the practices that perpetuate toxic stress within our society. Hosted by experts in trauma-informed care, this podcast is a vital part of promoting Trauma-Informed Philippines 2030 initiative, proudly brought to you by UDRiVe Group. And I am Poy de Lara, your trauma and resilience life coach and founder of UDRiVe Group Philippines. At Soapbox, we aim to speak meaningful conversations about topics that often overlooked and brushed aside, shedding light on the root causes of trauma and toxic stress in Filipino communities. From discussing the impact of the Machismo culture on men's mental health to examining intersections of socioeconomic factors and colonial legacies, our podcast delves to deep dive into the complexities of the Filipino society within the trauma-informed lens. Our mission is clear: to change the way we care, help understand, and respond to trauma in the Philippine setting. Through thought-provoking discussions, expert insights, and real-life stories, we strive to empower our listeners and viewers the knowledge and tools to foster healing and resilience in our communities. So please stay tuned and join us in the Soapbox PH as we challenge societal norms, confront difficult truths, and work towards building more compassionate and trauma-informed Philippines so that we together could create a positive change and transform the way we support one another. For this very first episode, we are honored to welcome one of my mentors in trauma healing. I consider him as one of my life's heroes and dear friend, Dr. Robert Roten, founder and co-CEO of the Arizona Trauma Institute in Therapy and a fellow of the American Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress, as our esteemed guest.
The Soapbox PH.
Dr. Roten is a renowned leader in the field of trauma-informed care with extensive experience in addressing the complex intersections of trauma, mental health, and culture. With an understanding of the Filipino context and a commitment to promoting healing and resilience, Dr. Roten brings an invaluable expertise to our discussion. We're now going to explore the impact of Machismo culture and other practices such as utang na loob, debt of gratitude in the next episodes, hiya or sense of shame, colorism, and family-centered expectations and more that create toxic stress in the Filipino context. Dr. Roten's insights will guide us towards great understanding and meaningful change. How are you today?
I'm excellent. Thank you for inviting me to visit with you.
It's a privilege to welcome you today as my very first guest here in this podcast. Can you tell me more about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. I probably should own the fact that the reason I was originally attracted to working with trauma was because of my own past history of abuse. For those of you that are familiar with the ACEs study, and if you're not, I'm sure you'll become so, but I peg 9 out of 10. And so, it took me a long time to unravel that. As I moved into the mental health field and as I began to go through school and then once I graduated, what I found was that most of what I had learned, I really believed when I was going to school. And I had this idealized view that I'm going to go out there and produce healing in people's lives. And what I discovered was that I was grossly underprepared and I didn't know enough. And I began really making a study of things. And I began to understand trauma at a different level because I switched from focusing on what people normally think to focus on, which is emotions and thinking. And I began to shift more to social environment. And then I moved even further past that into the idea that you have to get people regulated before you can get anything else done. And that was the premise that I taught for 20 years. And so when I taught college, I taught in college counseling programs. After 20 years of teaching, I figured I should take it easy. And I formed the Arizona Trauma Institute, and I figured I was going to do a little consulting work. And now we deliver trainings in 140 countries. Yeah, that's my journey to where I'm at. What makes us different or sets us apart as an organization, the Arizona Trauma Institute, was founded on the principles of a pseudogenic approach to working with people. And in traditional mental health, and a lot of times in education and business, we tend to think that the problems people are having are based in some deficit, some hole in the head, some inappropriate emotion. What we not only discovered through our own research and work was that a lot of what was going on was responses built through lived experience. Whether they looked normal to someone else or not, they were completely biologically predictable. And it began to revolutionize how we approach things. The salutogenic approach, if you've never heard of that before, is an approach that focuses on how do we create well-being, how do we create health, rather than how do we fix broken parts. So we've been around for a number of years, and we really enjoy what we do. We now have trainers all over the place, and it's really a joy to see this work be making an impact. So that's a little bit about me, my background.
Thank you for sharing that. And I myself is grateful that I was able to take part in that initiative. I'm a product of Arizona Trauma Institute myself. This is where I learned profound understanding of where I was coming from with an ACE score of adverse childhood experience score of 8, and a history of addiction and suicidality in the past that wasn't easy for me to handle. But with the understanding that Dr. Rotan and his colleagues taught me, I was able to deal with myself first so that I'd be able to help people better. Thank you for sharing that. So please shed a light on what is toxic stress and what causes it. Because when people hear about stress, they kind of stress out about stress itself.
Well, stress, as I'm referring to it, is, a lot of people, if you say, well, what's stressful? They'll say my teenagers. And they are sincere when they say it. Or traffic. I understand, and any of you that live in Manila realize what traffic looks like. What we've been trained to think is stress is really things that are upsetting. And really, stress is a reaction of the body to the environment. And our bodies are not designed to be in constant states of stress. And when they are, it really begins to tear the body apart. It begins to manifest biologically correct results and responses, but those responses are often annoying or disruptive. Kind of moving through this process is an understanding that stress is really body-centered, and it's not a willful choice. You didn't wake up on a Saturday morning and think, gosh, I'm going to be this way and I'm going to love it. And no, you don't do that. What you do is basically you respond to what's going on in the environment. So when we start talking about toxic stress, we are always looking at environments. When you're a child, the environment you're responding to, either prenatally, the stress of the mother, or postnatally, the stress in the family environment. And stress doesn't necessarily need to tie to any kind of abusive behavior. There's a lot of families that are just stressful by the nature of how they operate. And that stress triggers responses in the body of a child that actually change the way their brain is built and the way their muscles work and the way their heart and respiratory system works. And so, when you start understanding that stress is primarily a biological reaction to the environments that we're in initially, and then as we begin to age, we also develop another response set, which is our internal environment. The constructs we've made inside of ourselves. And now we get a dual dose of stress, environment out, environment in. But a lot of times, if we're stressed pretty highly outside of ourselves, we tend to disconnect in our awareness of the stress within ourselves. But the stress within ourselves is probably the one that needs to be stabilized the most.
How come other people are more resilient to stress than others?
Well, it has a lot to do with their body's learning history. When you think about this, the body's designed to adapt. So let me give you a silly example. Someone that's in stress for long periods of time, it's a lot of work for their body to take them from this little baseline area where they are. And because the stress is happening, their body's being filled with what we call stress-related hormones. I call it a fiery cocktail. Dose after dose after dose is a fiery cocktail. And what happens is it's a lot of work to bring that down and bring it down and bring it down and bring it down. And so what the body does is adapt, and it moves the baseline up. And that's what we call hypertension or high blood pressure, which is a stress-related disease most of the time. So when you start looking at this, what happens in the body of people that live in stress-related environments, their body becomes overly sensitized. In other words, it reacts faster to those hormonal releases because they've adapted. So they don't need as much to get a charge. So if let's say that in order to get a reaction, you needed something on the equivalent of a power plant to get you going. But for somebody that has had a tremendous history of toxic stress, what you're going to find is a 9-volt battery will set them off. And so this idea that it is good, bad, right, wrong, has anything to do with the character of the person is a faulty idea. If I'm sensitized and my body's adapted, I'm reacting at really low levels of this stuff. The other adaptation the body makes, because it's too much work to keep trying to push you back down to baseline, it now lingers. And instead of really working hard to kind of get that stuff metabolized, it kind of takes its own lazy time. So what we know is if somebody gets a good dose of the fiery cocktail, it can take somewhere between 30 and 40 hours for the body to metabolize that if they have a history of toxic stress. Someone that doesn't have a history of toxic stress should be able to metabolize that somewhere between 3 and 6 hours. So it really is that the lived experience of people create the risk factor for toxic stress.
So what are the conditions or the common conditions that could cause toxic stress?
Well, how early do you want to start?
Like the most basic.
The most basic, oh my gosh. Okay, here we go. Of course, I don't guarantee that people won't turn off this recording as they start listening. So where it starts, if you really think about it, if the mother, while pregnant, is living in a stressful environment, if it's chaotic, and here's what we're looking for, if it's chaotic, punitive, aggressive, if it's unpredictable, in other words, it's not really stable, and if the structure of it is constantly in a state of change, those things are global kind of concerns that create toxic stress. You add to that a lot of dynamics. When toxic stress is going on, some people adapt to that by moving into over-controlling behavior. And now what you get is also a layer of shame and contempt. So when you take those issues that are biologically going on and you add shame and contempt to them, you have a recipe to destroy the nervous system of the child. This begins, I can explain this pretty simply. Around the middle of the second trimester, the stress hormones that are going on in the mother, though that fiery cocktail, makes its way across the placenta. And as it enters that child, that fetus's system, it triggers responses that should not be triggered for a few years. This activation of their system while their body is developing can actually compromise the body. So you have an increased risk of ADHD, you have an increased risk of autism, you have an increased risk of all sorts of health-related issues, particularly asthma and allergies, eczema. All of these things are going to have an increased risk factor because of what the mother is experiencing in the second trimester. There's a biological reason for this. Geneticists and, people that do that kind of research have repeatedly pointed out what the reason that stuff is being translated through the placenta to the child is to help the child be prepared to live in the environment of the mother once the child is born. Well, so if we have a very stressed mother and she's pregnant, and then that child is born into that stressed environment, they're already wired to respond. They're already much more sensitive to the environment, and they're going to be more reactive. And you're going to see with children, particularly young children, see a lot of anger and aggression and rage. They don't learn very well from normal empathy-related kinds of things because we built them that way in utero. So that's where your toxic stress journey can begin. Then if your home is one of those homes where people love each other, but there's this unrelenting, for example, one of the things that I think is really interesting in a number of different cultures, not just the Philippine culture, is that the family wants to dictate what the children do, how they do it, and the parameters of everything. And yet the same parents that are doing that grew up hating that. But because they're not regulated well enough to choose differently, they end up doing the same thing. And what it does is puts a demand load, which we call an unrelenting demand of constant stress on the child. And, quite often family members, particularly when you're dealing with intergenerational family structures, you have layers of family stress being put on a person. And so it becomes, if you think about how people react to that, what we see quite often intergenerationally over time is the emergence of a honor culture or machismo culture, where the way people deal with it is by moving into over control. And so they get assaultive, they get aggressive, they get punitive, they get really sensitive about slights, and they get angry if their ways aren't, being followed, that they just really are in an over control mode. And when that becomes the norm in any culture, what it does is ramps up the amount of toxic stress in those home environments.
I'm hearing a lot of things that saying that children now is different from the children before, or the adults now. Is it because of that it gets passed on, like you said, that it's intergenerational, and then the loss of control is more needed? Like having that sense of control is more needed. Hence the development of the cultures that you've mentioned, like the Machismo culture and everything.
You see machismo cultures kind of grow up in cultures that had 100, 150, 200 years of oppression. And also you have cultures that were conquering cultures. They were very over the top. So, when you had that colonialism going on, you have a highly aggressive government and people moving into a community and demanding changes to the culture, demanding whatever they demand, which is unique to each colonialism. But the reality is that the culture that is aggressive and punitive and over controlling becomes attractive to the oppressed people. And it even changes how they see beauty. It sees, I've been all over the world. And what I think is really interesting is those countries that were colonized by Europeans, and I'm going to include Spain and the Mediterranean in that, seem to have this idea that white is somehow better. And that's insane. There's only a little bit of difference in melanin in the skin, but they were the conquerors, and people did not like feeling disempowered, and it became kind of a cultural thing to want to emulate the person that has power. And so you see a lot of that as well. So then there are just layers and layers and layers of things that happen in cultures to begin to create increasing levels of toxic stress. And then if you live in a culture that, when you think about it, all of the ways that we connect and not connect exacerbate that. Somebody was telling me the other day, well, I don't understand why everything seems to be going worse. And I said, well, part of that is you get more of what you focus on. And every news show you watch, what's it focus on? Every conversation with people in a coffee shop, what does it focus on? You don't see a lot of people getting together and talking about or celebrating, hey, did you notice that Joe was in the paper for, this wonderful thing that he did? No, you don't ever see that because it doesn't sell. What societies have ended up doing that actually create a lot of stress is they use dysregulation as their primary marketing approach and their primary attract, because of the way the brain and the nervous system are wired or survival oriented. We tend to have a natural negativity bias, and we will remember the negative many times faster and longer than we will any positive.
Is there also a biological explanation for that?
If your body is being changed before you're born, and then we ramp it up when you get here, and you grow up in that kind of stress, and you have a child, your child is going to be born with a greater mass and volume in those areas tied to reactivity. So what you end up with is a lot of times a really overdeveloped response system, a protective system, and an underdeveloped system that would allow you to function better, think more clearly, and problem solve more efficiently.
Thank you. Machismo culture, we will explore the traditional gender roles and how it does perpetuate toxic stress and trauma, particularly among men who feel pressured to conform with rigid masculine norms. What are some of the key characteristics of the machismo culture, and how do these norms shape men's behavior and attitude towards mental health?
Well, part of the, and this comes back to the over-controlling behavior. One of the things about over-controlling behavior is I should be able to control my environment. Really, the more I am stressed, the more stress responses I'm having, the more likely I am to use very aggressive means. What you're getting is this combination of cortisol and noradrenaline. And just a small increase in noradrenaline, and you're going to be hostile and aggressive. And so what we have is stress put upon men to conform because this is the way you're supposed to be. But that's pretty stressful, and they try to live up to it. But on the other side of it, most of them end up, because they're not really secure, this is what you do because this is what great grandfather did, is not, not often a good reason to do a thing. Or this is I have 60 first and second cousins, and that's the way they do it, is also not a good reason to do something. But quite often, when people are not regulating, they will bow to social culture. In other words, they substitute roles or ideology for actual thinking and reflection. And so instead of really thinking, is this how I want to show up, which requires them to be regulating and self-reflective, they just do what everybody else around them is doing. And yet, if you accuse them of that, they'll be very upset with you.
I know. I saw this podcast that says that when they teach boys, that boys, when they play with dolls, they learn how to care for another human being, right? But then again, what's happening right now is when boys plays with dolls, they say, no, don't play with that. Instead, play with guns and play with this stuff, right? So I think that's also what's happening and where it starts, basically, like
Sure.
the doll.
Well, and think about it. And rather than trying to go into a lot of the science of this, let me see if I can put it in a metaphor that might be easier. I want you to think of a hunter. A hunter is seeking a prey, whatever that prey is. And the prey doesn't want to be hunted. And what we see is kind of this hunter mentality in machismo cultures, and this need to be, to be seen somehow better than they are, to be seen as being the one in charge, this is really important to them. And so they put stress on themselves, and then they put stress on the people around them. But reality is, because they're filled with this uncertainty, this stress, this, I must appear this way, whether I really feel that way or not, I have to appear that way. That's part of that culture. Then what you end up with is this self-imposed limitation. And one of the results of the self-imposed limitation is I can't allow any kind of vulnerability. If I am vulnerable, I'm not fulfilling this role. Even if I would really like to be vulnerable, being vulnerable is dangerous. I shouldn't do that. Good predators are not vulnerable. Vulnerability is for prey, not for hunters. And so in machismo cultures, we run into a lot of that predator mindset. And in society in large, the predators are valued more than the non-predators. And really to shift this, what we really hope people will do is adopt a fisherman's mindset. The fisherman is patient. The fisherman pays attention to the bait that they use. They tend to fish only where fish are. And they have an ongoing belief system that fish will come and that it's patient. And it draws, it's an attraction. And predators tend to want to chase down and conquer and own. And so the difference is really quite stunning. In machismo cultures, we're rewarding predatory behavior that may have had survival value 10 generations ago. Does it really have survival value today? But in order to have that thought process, people need to be out of stress long enough to learn the skills to regulate themselves, and then they can be self-reflective. But right now, being vulnerable and self-reflective are not culturally enforced. And in fact, if you do that, you might lose your man card. And so, it really does drive that machismo culture.
Speaking of man card, how does this culture contribute to suppression of emotions among men, and what are the implications of this emotional restraint on their mental health well-being?
Well, what you see, and again, you're going to see this in any machismo culture, is an increased amount of addiction, because one of the ways you deal with that constant level of stress is drink yourself silly. You go do your work, come home, you don't want to be bothered with anybody, you just want you want a downtime, get intoxicated to release stress. We see high levels of alcoholism and other forms of addictive behavior that emerge in machismo cultures. That's not unique, but we just see it. Whereas in cultures that are what we would consider underfunctioning, we see more addiction that is drug related. But in more machismo culture, unless there's really cultural restrictions against alcohol, like if we were in a Muslim country, you're going to see a lot of alcoholism. And of course, there's all the things that come along with alcoholism: increased levels of domestic violence, dissolution of families. You find a lot of machismo men want to make babies and not take care of them. What they end up doing is substituting sex for intimacy. Intimacy requires vulnerability. There's no way in hell I'm going to be vulnerable, so I'll just have all the sex I can. Sex becomes kind of a replacement for intimacy. And so they get into relationships. They're not really happy with them, but they continue them, and they continue them in what I call serial monogamy. I love you this week. I love you this week. I love you this week. And that's really common in that kind of a cultural setting. This has horrific impacts on family. I mean, I know several Filipino families pretty well. And one of the things that I think has been kind of devastating for them, here's this little family, but dad has kids with a couple of other women there. And, when the kids get together, they're not always sharing the same co-parent. But it really does have a negative impact on the family as a whole. And the family as a whole that is impacted that way is more stressed. And so then we do see generation after generation of this behavior being repeated.
Thank you. So you also have touched a couple of the questions that we had. Next question is, could you elaborate on the association between adherence to traditional masculinity norms, intimate partner violence?
Well, we have men that have never been taught to regulate themselves. I'm not talking about willpower to stop, bad behavior or an unfortunate, situation behavior. What I'm really looking at is where we don't teach men to regulate themselves so that they can make intentional, deliberate choices. They're expected to conform to some social idea that doesn't even have consistency from person to person or family to family. But we have this idea that everybody is doing it this way, and we need to do it that way as well. Most people don't have the skills to kind of create that. And so they end up using force to try to control. In the mindset of the machismo person who has been rewarded for predatory behavior, control is really important. And anything that tends to look like I might lose control, I've got to do something aggressive to get that resolved. I'm either going to attack you verbally or I'm going to attack you physically. Now, so we know the mechanism behind it, but the real question, we always want to treat the domestic violence. That's really kind of the problem. That's like treating it after the fact. What we really need to do is to work with men, and I think particularly young men that are just beginning their relational adventures, and really help them kind of learn to regulate themselves and help families regulate whole groups of family. Because if we don't help people regulate, we're going to get habituated, stress-related responses rather than really deliberate, intentional thought processes. Because I've talked to a number of people that some that were even arrested for killing family members. Most of them didn't intend to do that. It was they just couldn't control the rage inside of them because no one had ever taken the time to really help them understand what was going on, and that they have the power to manage it themselves.
That's interesting. So you mean to say when a person is really dysregulated, morality can get thrown out of the window, right?
Morality's gone because the only time we're really moral is when we're deliberate and intentional. Otherwise, I'm just in reaction mode.
Right. And most of the reactions that we see, like addiction, those are not socially acceptable. But since these are biological responses, we can do something about it.
That's right. The responses people take, which is what's happening with addiction, is people's level of distress is such that they'll do anything they possibly can to not feel that. And a lot of times they're masking their own history of unfortunate experiences as well. And so they look for something that can initially take the edge off. And then something that allows them to totally avoid having to deal with those things at all. And that's kind of the window for addiction, whether we want to admit it or not. Addiction really does have a tremendous foundation in early life development. A couple of well-regulated parents are in a place to help raise children that are well-regulated. And to change a culture, we have to be able to get enough people in any culture regulated well enough to be intentional and deliberate rather than reactive, and then perpetuate it a generation or so. And when I say that to people, they say, well, that's very Star Trek-ish of you. And I don't mean it to be, but it's going to take some time, because the reason these cultures emerge is because they have survival value for the culture at large to do that. And even though those times have passed, because you're in states of arousal quite often, you're in that state of stress quite often, you're not usually being self-reflective. Is this who I really want to show up as? What happens is, after the fact, when you behave like an ass, then you beat up on yourself. I should have known better. That's putting a water bucket in a barn that's already burned down. It's kind of unhelpful at that point. It just adds to the shame cycle or the self-contempt cycle. And those are uncomfortable emotions. So what we do is we're going to go out and drink more.
So Dr. Roden, when is the best time to teach maybe kids, not only boys, of course, but kids, to self-regulate so they could grow to be a well-regulated person?
I don't think there's any gender difference here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean to be insensitive to any group. Just this is biology stuff. And however you identify yourself, that's fine. But the biology is pretty much the same with everybody. And so what we think everybody should be able to do is be able to regulate themselves. And it has to start, or let me put it, the most efficient way to create that change is for parents to be regulated before they start having children. People always want to think about, well, how do we fix the problem? Well, no, we need to think differently. Where do we interrupt the problem? And that is to teach, if I had, in my perfect world, if I had the ability to do this, I would design really good quality programming for parents that was fun to do. They could teach them how to regulate before the woman ever got pregnant, and how to create the right environment to maximize an optimal experience for the child. The child doesn't need a parent that's a friend. They need a parent that is a parent, that leads that child, dictates to that child, not, is a tyrant, but is a nurturing parent. And the other piece which is kind of funny, and it's really what we know, is that if the individual parents are not very astute at being able to do that, in cultures where the children are a communal responsibility, where there are at least some adults in that environment that can provide that kind of stability, that kind of environment for the kid. But a lot of times what we see in particular large urban environments is a lot of disconnection between those supportive environments. And so you really have to focus your programming, at least in large urban areas, on how do we stabilize parents, and how do we stabilize a lot of them, and how do we help, if I had enough money, I would just do that. That would be my thing. How do we stabilize families through helping them learn to regulate their own system?
Same. I always say that if I do have enough resources, I just focus on that group, because who needs it the most, right? Regarding that, how do intersecting forms of oppression, such as socioeconomic factors, exacerbate stress and trauma in these marginalized communities within the context of the machismo culture?
The Adverse Childhood Experience study was the first social determinant of health that we knew of, which said social environment creates poor mental health and shortened lifespan. And so, we began, and now we realize there are about 30 social determinants of health that are affecting the quality of life. And the World Health Organization collects data on them. And I think it's beginning to make that shift. The challenge is, how do we make it attractive for young men and young women want to be regulated, when almost a lot of cultures, this has been my experience, and it may be totally wrong in your culture, but what I find is that young people in general tend to love good drama. They create a lot of it. Being calm and well regulated seems like stuff you do when you're an old person. Well, you can have that attitude when you're 13 or 14. But the problem is, if you have that attitude at that age, the chances are you're not going to make much, you're not going to see it much differently till you get into your 50s. By the time you've already done all the damage you possibly could to your family. So it is really, how do we make it attractive to young people to want to be focused when everything in their culture, and I'm modern culture in general, I've got to be on my cell phone all day long. I've got to make sure I'm tracking what my friends are doing. We have institutionalized distractions that really, you don't want to be self-aware. If you're self-aware, you're not going to buy this thing I want you to buy on impulse. If you're self-aware, you're not going to use credit cards because you might as well be enslaved. If we actually did approach being able to help young people want to be regulated, in a couple of generations, we'd completely change culture. There are so many influences in the world that don't want people to be regulated. I don't know enough about the politics in the Philippines, but I can tell you that neither political party that's dominant in the U.S. wants a population to be well regulated. Because if they were self-reflective and really evaluative, none of those politicians would be in office. And some that are would be gone pretty quickly. It's a funny kind of mechanism. We don't like the consequences of stress, but there isn't any part of the oversight of government that really wants you to be that way.
That is so true. Even in the Philippines, politics is a very big issue, but we need them and we help them. So, hey, politicians, out to you to help us. So, when it comes to the U.S. and Canada has a very diverse demographic when it comes to race and culture, right? Can you provide insights on how experiences of racism and sexism intersect with traditional masculinity norms and how intersectionality impacts mental health for all demographics?
No. There are so many cultures here. It would be we would be here a long, long time, and I don't know that I know very many of them well enough to read. What is going on in the U.S. to help people navigate the differences in cultural backgrounds in embracing this. So one of the nice things about a salutogenic approach is because it's biology centered, the biology works the way the biology works. And it doesn't matter ethnicity, cultural background, having a certain amount of increase in cortisol, noradrenaline in your system is going to trigger these predictable results. And it's going to have the potential of these negative impacts. That's just human. And one of the nice things about coming at this from this perspective is we actually, then the real key is learning how to incorporate this into each of those cultures. So how do we help them make sense of it? One of the things that we're working on right now in Pakistan is the idea that they've really taken hold of the salutogenic idea. A number of universities have begun to do research around it. But the challenge they have there culturally, I'm just giving you this as an example, is that unless you're married, you're supposed to stay at home with your family. But if your family is your primary source of toxic stress, what you end up with is people that feel totally disempowered because socially they are not supposed to go out on their own, particularly if they're women. They're not supposed to go out on their own. We can't stabilize them very well in the environment that they're in. So when you start looking at this, well, how do we do it for this group? You have to kind of build it a group at a time, because how it would look in Filipino culture would be different than how it would look in Pakistani culture. And even that's kind of, when you look at Pakistan, you're dealing with Hindi, with Bedouin, with Kurdish. It's not just, so the real issue is we have to pick a starting point.
Right.
And we will have to figure it out as we move through the process. But it would be really nice if we could make being in charge about being grounded and thoughtful and intentional. And instead, what we have rewarded in every machismo culture is the role of the predator. We value the predator. We do not value the shepherds or the fishermen.
Right.
And the man that wants to be a shepherd or a fisherman is looked down on by all the other predators.
Right, and maybe the fisherman's thinking that they're not working fast enough. From your perspective, what are some potential strategies or interventions? You said the salutogenic approach, right, to address negative effects of machismo culture in men's mental health in the Philippines.
What I would do is I would actually begin to work at the grassroots level of men that are willing to even look at this. And I would train them on the physiology and give them a basic understanding of how to apply that in their own life and really do it from the point of view, let's see, which improvements do you notice as you begin to do this? You're going to have to build an enthusiasm through people seeing other people do it, because machismo culture is based on shared expectations. This is what men do on our culture. And when you don't do it, then the predator looks at you like maybe you're prey. But, getting that and kind of building it like a movement, like a grassroots movement. You start with a few, they learn these things and apply them themselves. They see the benefits. They become your champions. They train others. You train others. And over time, you're going to see some big changes. But when I say time, I'm not talking about in a year. I'm talking about 25 years. When I first started talking about this stuff with the legal system in Arizona, I would have judges really just cut me off, or I had a couple of judges tell me that I needed to stop talking about this stuff because otherwise they were going to charge me with contempt. And now we have the situation over 25 years later, where judges call and want to walk through cases to make sure before they sentence somebody that they're taking things into consideration that might be trauma related. It took 25 years to have that happen. And that's one of the reasons so many initiatives fail, is because we want an immediate result. But sustainable change, which is what you need for culture, are small incremental gains over time. And those small incremental gains build momentum.
So if we really want to change the future, we should start working now incrementally.
If I remember correctly, the Catholic Church is pretty big in the Philippines.
It is.
You might want to start with some of those organizations. But it's not something you're probably ever going to make any money at. It is just something you do for the good of your culture. Demotivates a lot of folks. Wait a minute. You want me to do this as a volunteer? We see all sorts of support groups out there. You can actually do this, but it just requires a group of people committed to creating the change.
Right. Right now, we have a bunch of support groups under the Step Forward Trauma Support Group, and we're going to launch one specifically for men in July. So that's a good avenue.
If you think about it, we taught you what over-controlling looks like. And you see that. If you want to look at the attributes of machismo culture and over-controlling, they're really aligned. So you want to address, because that's what they want to achieve this better by doing this, instead of the way I've seen program after program approach this from the perspective of the pathology base is you shouldn't do this and it's bad and we're going to tell you what you should do instead. But since we already know how overfunctioners function and what drives them, you're going to use a pseudogenic approach, which is what's admirable about those and how can we help them do a better job of doing those things. And I think that's the avenue that needs to be approached.
Finally, how can mental health professionals and policymakers work together to create more inclusive support system environments to encourage men to seek help?
The challenge is that, so I'm a man and I see a message from a therapy group saying, if you're having problems with these things, come see us. First of all, the fact, because an overfunctioner, how they're going to see that is someone's trying to manipulate me to get my money and they're trying to take advantage of me and I better be on guard. And so a lot of those programs don't do well because of that mindset. And so that's why I'm suggesting, if you're going to go after this, what are the important aspects of being machismo and how can they be more, but be a nurturing more rather than the pain in the butt more? You wouldn't put it that basically, but that's kind of what you're looking at, because program after program tells them that they're wrong. The desires that drive over control are not wrong. They're just habituated and not based on self-awareness or intentionality. What if we can help people be more intentional? And then they can seek after those same goals in more nurturing ways.
Right. So the common advertisements right now, they bank on what's wrong rather than what could you do and what they're capable of, right? That makes sense. It's making sense to me now. They have a threat response, and because this is wrong, this is what you have to do.
When somebody says to you, you're not doing it right, your heart doesn't open up and become warm and loving and accepting. You're not going to tell me that. I'll show you. And I don't care, male, female, kid, anybody. You confront them, you're going to turn their stress response system on. And we do it over and over again. We show pictures of strung out people and we say, you shouldn't use. And the person that uses and is using to escape distress, you've now distressed them, you've shamed them, and now they want to run out and use again. So I mean, it really does require a different thought process.
Right. So there's still a lot of things for us to do, especially in the Philippines right now. And I really admire what you've shared, how you started. I'm going to be patient and work through this. And patience.
I don't start with the same name as the same letter as Poy, but
I know it's not me. But anyway,
your turn to kind of grow some self-regulation.
So, Dr. Roten, please invite everyone to join your programs at Arizona Trauma Institute.
Arizona Trauma Institute, we have all sorts of programming for those that are clinical oriented or are doing coaching. We have really well-developed programs that will be very helpful to those that want to do online things. We have 60-plus courses. We do consulting all over the world. Right now, I'm working with the Nexus School in Singapore. If there's any way we can be of support, check us out.
Thank you for that. And as we conclude today's enlightening discussion with Dr. Roten, we extend our heartfelt invitation to all our listeners to join us in the next episodes and our upcoming workshops we've got in June, July, August, and September in the Philippines. These workshops will offer a unique opportunity to deepen your understanding about trauma-informed care. So we welcome all individuals, groups, couples, and families to check out our programs as well at UDRiVe. Please follow us on Facebook and also follow Arizona Trauma Institute so that you can change the way you care, help, understand, and respond. Thank you so much, Dr. Roten, and I'll see you again in the next episode.
We'll see you soon.